On a gray November morning in 1962, Joseph Edward Kowalski tightened his grip on a corroded pipe wrench and descended into the basement of a Georgetown townhouse, expecting nothing more complicated than a leaking water heater and perhaps a few hours of honest work. The address was 3247 Dumbarton Street, a stately brick residence that belonged to Senator William Caldwell, a senior member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, whose name appeared regularly in newspapers alongside discussions of defense appropriations and strategic weapons systems. Joe had been a master plumber in Washington for 23 years, navigating the ancient pipe systems of the nation's capital with the confidence of a man who understood that beneath every elegant facade ran miles of copper and iron that kept civilization functioning. He believed this Tuesday would unfold like the 8,000 service calls before it, a simple matter of diagnosing a problem, fixing it, and moving on to the next job. He had absolutely no reason to suspect that within 3 hours, his routine house call would thrust him into the center of a Soviet intelligence operation that had been running undetected for nearly 18 months. Or that the decision he would make in a damp basement surrounded by cobwebs and old furniture would ultimately expose one of the most sophisticated espionage networks operating on American soil. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Joseph Kowalski was 51 years old that November, a stocky man with powerful forearms and permanently grease-stained hands who had spent 3 decades working with pipes, valves, and water systems throughout Washington. He lived with his wife, Catherine, and their 4 children in a narrow row house in northeast Washington, where the smell of cabbage and kielbasa filled the kitchen most evenings, and where the walls bore framed photographs of relatives who had never left Poland. Joe's father had immigrated from Warsaw in 1908, bringing with him nothing but a trade learned from his own father and an unshakable belief that America offered something the Old World could not provide: the opportunity to build a life through honest labor without fear of arbitrary persecution or political violence. Joe had inherited both the trade and the philosophy, establishing Kowalski Plumbing and Heating in 1939, just months before Hitler's invasion of Poland made it impossible for any more relatives to escape. The war years had been busy for Joe. Washington exploded with new construction as the federal government expanded to manage the war effort, and every new office building and apartment complex needed plumbing. He worked 16-hour days installing fixtures and running pipes, saving enough money to buy his own modest home and to send his oldest son to college after. The war ended. By 1962, Kowalski Plumbing had become a small but successful operation with 2 trucks, a reliable roster of commercial and residential clients, and a reputation for quality work that kept the phone ringing steadily. Joe prided himself on his craftsmanship and his discretion. Washington was a city of secrets, where senators and diplomats and military officials lived in close proximity, and where a plumber often saw more of a house's interior than most visitors ever would. Joe had learned early in his career that successful tradesmen in the nation's capital understood an unspoken rule: you noticed nothing, you repeated nothing, and you focused exclusively on the pipes. The call from Senator Caldwell's office had come on Monday afternoon. The senator's assistant, a crisp-voiced woman who introduced herself as Mrs. Patterson, explained that the water heater in the senator's Georgetown residence had begun making unusual noises and was leaking from the pressure relief valve. Could Mr. Kowalski come first thing Tuesday morning? The senator would be at the Capitol for hearings, but the housekeeper would let him in and show him to the basement. Joe confirmed the appointment, noted the address in his work ledger, and thought nothing more about it. Senators and congressmen were just customers like anyone else, though their homes tended to be nicer and their thermostats set a few degrees warmer than the average working man could afford. Georgetown in 1962 was Washington's most prestigious neighborhood, where federal period townhouses lined cobblestone streets and where residents included Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, and the kind of wealthy families whose names appeared on hospital wings and university buildings. Joe drove his battered Ford panel truck through the tree-lined streets, navigating past expensive cars and well-dressed pedestrians with the unconscious ease of someone who had serviced Georgetown plumbing emergencies for 2 decades. The Caldwell residence was a 3-story red brick townhouse with white-painted shutters and a small front garden that was immaculately maintained despite the approaching winter. A brass plaque beside the door identified it as a historic property dating to 1852, one of those details Georgetown residents considered important and Joe considered irrelevant to the condition of their pipes. The housekeeper who answered his knock was a thin elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of formal manner that suggested decades of service in wealthy households. She introduced herself as Mrs. Chambers, led Joe through an elegant foyer with polished hardwood floors and expensive furniture, and showed him to a door beneath the main staircase that opened onto a steep wooden stairway leading down to the basement. "The water heater is along the back wall," she informed him. "There's a light switch at the bottom of the stairs. I'll be upstairs if you need anything. The senator has asked that you complete the work today if possible, as he's hosting a dinner party tomorrow evening." Joe assured her he would do his best, retrieved his toolbox and portable work light from the truck, and descended into the basement with the careful footing of a man whose knees had climbed too many stairs over too many years. The basement was typical of older Georgetown homes, a low-ceilinged space with exposed floor joists above and a concrete floor that showed water stains from decades of minor leaks and the occasional flood that plagued below-grade spaces throughout Washington. The air smelled of damp earth and old wood, and Joe could hear the distant rumble of the furnace in its automatic cycle. The water heater stood against the far wall, a 50-gallon gas unit perhaps 15 years old, with clear signs of corrosion around the pressure relief valve and a small puddle of water on the floor beneath it. Joe set down his toolbox, adjusted his work light, and began his examination. The problem was immediately apparent. The pressure relief valve had failed, a common issue with water heaters of this age, and would need to be replaced. The unusual noises Mrs. Patterson had mentioned were likely caused by sediment buildup in the bottom of the tank, which meant the unit should probably be flushed as part of the repair. Straightforward work, nothing Joe hadn't done hundreds of times before. He was kneeling beside the water heater, measuring the valve threads to ensure he had the correct replacement in his truck, when his elbow bumped against the wall behind him. The impact produced a hollow sound that immediately caught his attention. Joe had worked in enough basements to know the difference between solid brick and hollow spaces. He stood up, moved his work light closer, and examined the wall more carefully. What he had initially taken for a solid brick partition was actually a section that had been built more recently than the rest of the basement, probably sometime in the last 20 or 30 years. The bricks were slightly different in color, the mortar was newer, and most tellingly, the section extended only about 8 feet along the wall before returning to the original foundation work. Joe's first thought was that someone had enclosed old coal storage bins, a common renovation in Washington homes that had been converted from coal to gas heat. He returned his attention to the water heater, but the hollow wall nagged at him in a way he could not quite explain. There was something about its construction that felt wrong, purposeful, in a way that coal bin enclosures never were. After 30 years of working in basements, Joe had developed an instinct for how old houses were built, for what made structural sense, and what represented later additions. This wall bothered him. He walked along its length, tapping it lightly with his knuckles every few feet. The hollow sound continued for the entire 8-foot section, then returned to solid foundation beyond. Joe noticed something else. There was no door, no access panel, no way to reach the space behind the false wall. If this had been built to enclose coal bins or storage space, there would be some way to get inside. The fact that there was not suggested the wall had been built specifically to conceal something, not to provide storage. Joe told himself to focus on his work. He was a plumber, not an inspector, and what Senator Caldwell chose to do with his basement walls was none of Joe's concern. But the mystery of the hollow wall kept pulling at his attention like a loose thread on a sweater. His father had taught him that good workmanship meant paying attention to details, noticing when something was not quite right. That instinct had served Joe well throughout his career, helping him identify problems that other plumbers missed, preventing small issues from becoming major disasters. Now that same instinct was telling him that something about this wall demanded investigation. He walked back to his toolbox and pulled out a small flashlight, then knelt down and examined the base of the false wall where it met the concrete floor. There, nearly invisible unless you were looking for it, was a hairline gap about 1/4 of an inch wide. Joe directed his flashlight beam into the gap and saw darkness beyond, confirming the hollow space. He moved his light along the gap and caught a glimpse of something that made his heart skip. It was a wire, a thin black wire that ran along the floor behind the false wall, disappearing into the darkness. Joe sat back on his heels, his mind racing. There was no legitimate reason for a wire to be running behind a sealed wall. Power lines and telephone cables in old houses ran through the walls and ceiling joists, not along the floor behind purposefully constructed partitions. This wire had been placed there deliberately by someone who wanted it hidden. The implications were troubling in ways Joe did not want to consider. He thought about Senator Caldwell, about the Armed Services Committee, about the classified information that must pass through this house on a regular basis. He thought about the newspapers he read every morning, filled with stories about Soviet espionage and the ongoing crisis in Cuba, where American and Soviet forces had stood on the brink of nuclear war just weeks earlier. He thought about his father, who had fled a Europe consumed by tyranny and violence, who had taught Joe that freedom was not a given, but a constant struggle that required vigilance from ordinary citizens. Joe made a decision that he knew might make him look foolish, but felt necessary nonetheless. He returned to his truck, retrieved a pry bar from his tool collection, and went back down to the basement. He positioned the pry bar in the mortar joint between 2 bricks about 3 feet up from the floor and applied steady pressure. The mortar was newer than the surrounding foundation and gave way more easily than Joe expected. The first brick came loose with a grinding sound, then a second, then a third. Within 15 minutes, Joe had created an opening large enough to shine his flashlight through. What he saw in the narrow beam of light made his hands begin to shake. Behind the false wall was a space about 3 feet deep and 8 feet long. It was not empty. Against the back wall stood a wooden shelf holding what appeared to be radio equipment, sophisticated electronics unlike anything Joe had seen in residential basements. There was a reel-to-reel tape recorder, professional grade, not the small machines that families use to record children's voices. There was a receiver with multiple dials and frequency displays. Most disturbing was a microphone system with wires running up through the ceiling joists, disappearing into the house above. The equipment was dusty but clearly operational, connected to a power source Joe could not immediately identify. Joe withdrew his head from the opening and sat on the cold concrete floor, trying to process what he had discovered. This was not old radio equipment someone had stored and forgotten. This was an active listening station, professionally installed, designed to monitor conversations happening somewhere in the house above. The implications were staggering and terrifying. Someone had been listening to Senator Caldwell, recording his conversations, gathering intelligence on a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee who had access to the nation's most closely guarded military secrets. Joe's first instinct was to run up the stairs, find Mrs. Chambers, and demand to know who had built this false wall and installed this equipment. But something stopped him. If Mrs. Chambers knew about the listening station, which seemed likely given her long tenure in the house, then confronting her might warn whoever was operating this equipment. If she did not know, then telling her might put her in danger. Either way, this was beyond what a plumber should handle. This required authorities, professionals who dealt with espionage and national security. Joe carefully replaced the bricks he had removed, using loose mortar from the floor to roughly secure them back in position. The repair would not withstand close inspection, but from a few feet away, it looked undisturbed. He completed his work on the water heater with hands that trembled slightly, replacing the pressure relief valve and flushing the sediment from the tank with mechanical precision, while his mind churned through the implications of what he had found. Mrs. Chambers came down to check on his progress as he was testing the repairs. "Everything is fixed," Joe told her, keeping his voice steady. The valve was corroded, and the tank had sediment buildup. "But it's all working properly now. You shouldn't have any more problems." She thanked him, wrote him a check from the senator's household account, and showed him to the door. Joe carried his toolbox to his truck with forced casualness, started the engine, and drove 3 blocks before pulling over to the curb and sitting with his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to hurt. He needed to report what he had found. But to whom? The local police? They handled robberies and traffic accidents, not espionage. The FBI? That seemed right. But the thought of calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation made Joe feel like a character in a spy novel, not a working plumber with a mortgage and 4 kids to feed. What if he was wrong? What if there was some innocent explanation for the equipment he had seen? What if Senator Caldwell knew about it and had installed it himself for some legitimate purpose Joe could not imagine? The doubt lasted about 30 seconds before Joe's common sense reasserted itself. There was no innocent reason to hide professional radio and recording equipment behind a false wall in a basement. Someone had gone to considerable trouble and expense to monitor the senator's home, and that someone was engaged in espionage. Joe had stumbled onto something important, something dangerous, and he had a responsibility to report it regardless of how foolish it might make him feel. He drove to a payphone outside a drugstore on Wisconsin Avenue, fed coins into the slot, and dialed the operator. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," he said. "Washington Field Office." There was a pause, a series of clicks, then a professional female voice. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. How may I direct your call?" Joe took a deep breath. "My name is Joseph Kowalski. I'm a plumber, and I need to report something I found during a service call this morning. I think it might involve espionage." There was the briefest hesitation. Then the voice became more focused. "Please hold, sir. I'm transferring you to an agent." Another series of clicks, then a male voice, deep and authoritative. "This is Special Agent Thomas Brennan. To whom am I speaking?" "Joe Kowalski, sir. I'm a plumber here in Washington. I was doing work at a senator's house this morning, and I found something in the basement that I think you need to know about." Agent Brennan's tone sharpened. "What did you find, Mr. Kowalski?" Joe described the false wall, the wire, the radio equipment and microphone system hidden behind the bricks. As he spoke, he could hear Brennan taking notes, the scratch of pen on paper coming clearly through the phone line. "Mr. Kowalski," Brennan said when Joe finished, "which senator's residence was this?" Joe gave him the address. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, long enough that Joe wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Brennan spoke again, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "Mr. Kowalski, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not return to that address. Do not call anyone else about what you found. Do not discuss this with anyone, including your wife or your employees. Can you come to the FBI field office right now? We're on Pennsylvania Avenue. I'll meet you at the reception desk in 30 minutes. Joe agreed, hung up the phone, and drove through Washington's lunch hour traffic with his mind spinning. The urgency in Agent Brennan's voice had confirmed what Joe already suspected. This was serious. More serious than he had allowed himself to fully acknowledge while standing in that basement. He had found a Soviet listening post in a United States senator's home, and the implications of that discovery reached far beyond one compromised official. The FBI field office was a stolid gray building that projected bureaucratic authority without the grandeur of the Capitol or the elegance of Georgetown townhouses. Joe identified himself to the receptionist and was immediately escorted to a conference room where Agent Brennan was waiting along with two other men in dark suits. Brennan was in his early 40s, with iron gray hair and the kind of focused intensity that made Joe think of his old platoon sergeant from World War I. The other agents were younger, one taking notes while the other set up what appeared to be a tape recorder. "Mr. Kowalski," Brennan said, gesturing to a chair, "thank you for coming in so quickly. What you reported on the phone is extremely serious. We need you to tell us everything you saw, every detail you can remember, no matter how insignificant it might seem." For the next 2 hours, Joe walked the agents through his entire morning, from Mrs. Chambers letting him into the house to his discovery of the false wall, to his decision to open it and examine the space beyond. The agents asked probing questions. How old did the brickwork appear? What brands were on the electronic equipment? How many wires ran up through the ceiling? Could Joe draw a diagram of the basement layout? When Joe finished, Agent Brennan leaned back and exchanged glances with his colleagues. "Mr. Kowalski," one of the younger agents said, "you've given us detailed information about what appears to be a sophisticated intelligence operation. We need to verify your observations and determine who installed this equipment and who has been operating it. That will require surveillance of the senator's residence and a detailed investigation that may take some time. In the meantime, we need you to continue your normal routine. If Senator Caldwell's office calls you again for any reason, you accept the work and behave exactly as you normally would. We don't want to alert whoever installed that equipment that we're investigating." Joe felt ice water flood his veins. "You want me to go back there? Knowing what's behind that wall? What if they realize I found it? What if whoever installed that equipment decides I'm a threat?" Agent Brennan's expression softened slightly. "Mr. Kowalski, we will have agents watching the residence 24 hours a day from this point forward. Nothing will happen to you. But your cooperation in maintaining normal appearances could be crucial to this investigation. If the operators of that listening post suspect we're onto them, they'll shut down the operation, and we'll lose the opportunity to identify everyone involved." Joe thought about his father, about the choice to flee Poland or stay and face the growing darkness that would eventually consume Europe. He thought about his own choices now. The safe option of going back to his normal life and pretending he had never seen what lay behind that false wall, or the harder path of helping these agents protect the country that had given his family refuge and opportunity? Joe asked, "What if I refuse? You can't compel me to help you, can you?" Brennan shook his head. "No, Mr. Kowalski, we can't. If you want to walk away from this, we'll understand. But I'll tell you something my father told me when I was considering joining the Bureau. He said that evil succeeds when good men do nothing, and that every citizen who turns away from their responsibility to protect the common good makes it easier for the enemies of freedom to succeed. You've already shown courage by coming here today. Now we're asking if you'll show a bit more." Joe thought about his kids, about the America they were growing up in, about the Cold War that threatened to turn hot with nuclear fire. He thought about Senator Caldwell, who probably had no idea his home had been compromised, who was making decisions about weapons systems and military strategy while Soviet intelligence listened to every word spoken in his house. Joe nodded slowly. "I'll help, but I want to know what you find. When this is over, I want to know I made the right choice." Over the following 3 weeks, Joe continued his normal work routine while FBI agents conducted round-the-clock surveillance of the Caldwell residence. Agent Brennan kept Joe informed of their progress through brief phone calls to payphones Joe was instructed to visit at specific times. The agents had confirmed Joe's observations. The listening post was active, with the equipment recording conversations from microphones placed throughout the first floor of the townhouse. The wires ran up through the ceiling joists and into the walls, a professional installation that must have taken days to complete. The more troubling discovery was that the equipment was being serviced regularly. Twice in 3 weeks, agents observed a man entering the Caldwell residence through the basement door that opened onto an alley behind the house. He arrived late at night, stayed for approximately 30 minutes, and departed carrying what appeared to be tape reels in a briefcase. The FBI photographed him during both visits and identified him through comparison with known Soviet intelligence officers. His name was Alexei Volkov, officially an attaché at the Soviet embassy, but confirmed by FBI counterintelligence to be a KGB officer running what the Bureau suspected was a network of American sources. The implications were staggering. The listening post in Senator Caldwell's basement was not an isolated operation, but part of a larger espionage network. Volkov's presence indicated that the Soviets considered the intelligence gathered from Caldwell's home important enough to assign a senior intelligence officer to personally service the equipment. The FBI now faced a decision. Should they arrest Volkov immediately and shut down the operation? Or should they leave it in place while they identified other members of his network? The choice had significant implications for American national security, but it also meant leaving Senator Caldwell's conversations exposed to Soviet monitoring for an undefined period. Agent Brennan explained the dilemma to Joe during one of their payphone conversations. "We've briefed the senator about the listening post," Brennan said. "He's understandably upset, but he's agreed to cooperate with our investigation. He'll continue living in the residence and conducting his normal activities, but we've instructed him to hold any sensitive discussions away from his home. We're using the listening post to feed selected information to the Soviets, material we want them to believe is legitimate intelligence, but is actually carefully prepared to mislead their assessments of American military capabilities." Joe absorbed this information with a mixture of fascination and unease. "You're running a double game," he said, "using what I found to spy on the spies." Brennan confirmed. "That's exactly what we're doing, Mr. Kowalski, and it's working. We've identified 3 other Soviet intelligence officers who appear to be part of Volkov's network, and we've traced dead drops and communication methods that give us insight into how Soviet intelligence operates in Washington. Your discovery of that listening post has opened up an entire counterintelligence operation. But we need your help one more time." "How?" Joe asked, though he already suspected what Brennan was going to request. "We need you to go back to the Caldwell residence for a follow-up inspection," Brennan said. "Make it routine, checking to ensure the water heater is working properly. While you're there, we need you to look at the false wall and see if there's any indication that Volkov or his associates have noticed your earlier examination. We need to know if they suspect the listening post has been compromised." Joe felt his stomach tighten. "And if they have noticed?" "Then we'll have to shut down the operation immediately," Brennan said. "But if they haven't noticed, we can continue using the listening post to mislead Soviet intelligence and gather information on their network." Joe made the return visit to the Caldwell residence on a cold Monday morning in early December, carrying his toolbox and wearing his normal work clothes while knowing that FBI agents were watching from multiple surveillance positions around the townhouse. Mrs. Chambers let him in with the same formal courtesy she had shown during his first visit, apparently unaware that her employer's home was the center of an ongoing espionage investigation. Joe inspected the water heater with genuine thoroughness, testing the pressure relief valve he had replaced and checking the tank for any new signs of problems. Then he examined the false wall, running his hands along the bricks and looking for any indication that someone had noticed his earlier intrusion. The bricks he had removed and replaced showed no signs of having been touched since his first visit. The mortar he had used to roughly secure them remained undisturbed, covered by the same thin layer of dust that coated the rest of the basement. Either Volkov had not examined this section of wall closely during his servicing visits, or he had noticed the repair but chosen not to react in a way that might reveal his awareness of surveillance. Joe completed his inspection and reported to Mrs. Chambers that everything was working properly. She thanked him, mentioned that the senator had been very pleased with his work, and suggested that Kowalski Plumbing might become the regular service provider for the residents. Joe accepted the compliment with appropriate gratitude, while internally marveling at the layers of deception in play. The senator knew his home was bugged. The FBI knew the senator knew. The Soviets did not know the FBI knew. And Joe, a plumber who had simply wanted to fix a water heater, stood at the center of this elaborate game of intelligence and counterintelligence. That evening, Agent Brennan called Joe at home for the first time, a breach of the communication protocols they had followed for weeks. "Mr. Kowalski, I wanted you to hear this directly from me. We arrested Alexei Volkov this afternoon, along with 3 other Soviet intelligence officers and 2 American citizens who were providing them with classified information. The operation is over, and it succeeded in part because of your initial discovery and your subsequent cooperation." Joe felt a wave of relief mixed with residual anxiety. "What about the listening post? Are they going to remove the equipment?" Brennan paused. "That information is classified, Mr. Kowalski, and I can't discuss the specifics. But I can tell you that Senator Caldwell's home is now secure, and the immediate threat has been neutralized. The Bureau would like to commend you officially for your assistance, but that commendation will have to remain classified for the foreseeable future. Your name will not appear in any public records of this case. As far as the world knows, you were simply a plumber who fixed a water heater." Joe thought about this for a moment. "I don't need commendations or public recognition, Agent Brennan. I just needed to know I did the right thing." Brennan's voice carried genuine warmth. "You did more than the right thing, Mr. Kowalski. You helped protect your country at considerable personal risk. That's something you should be proud of, even if you can never talk about it." The case that became known within the FBI as Operation Hollow Wall remained classified for decades. Public records from 1962 show only that several Soviet bases Intelligence officers were declared persona non grata and expelled from the United States, with the State Department citing unspecified espionage activities. Senator Caldwell continued serving on the Armed Services Committee for another 12 years before retiring in 1974, never publicly acknowledging that his Georgetown home had been compromised. The American citizens arrested alongside Volkov were convicted of espionage in closed proceedings and sentenced to federal prison. The details of their crimes, the information they provided to Soviet intelligence, and the methods by which they were caught all remained classified. Joe returned to his normal life, installing water heaters and fixing leaking pipes throughout Washington while carrying the secret of what he had found in that Georgetown basement. Catherine noticed that something had changed in her husband after that November morning, a new quietness that suggested he was carrying weight he could not share. But she knew Joe well enough not to press him for explanations he was not free to provide. Years later, in 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Cold War began its final collapse, Joe sat in his living room watching the celebrations on television. His children, now adults with families of their own, were there with him, marveling at the images of Germans dancing on the wall that had divided their city for 28 years. Joe's oldest son, who had become a history professor, talked about how the Cold War had been won, not through military confrontation, but through the steady pressure of competing ideologies and the eventual economic exhaustion of the Soviet system. Joe listened to his son's analysis and thought about a false wall in a Georgetown basement, about radio equipment hidden behind bricks, about the small choices ordinary people made that accumulated into something larger than any individual could see. He had never told his children about that November morning in 1962, had honored the FBI's request for secrecy even as the years passed and the specific details of the case seemed less urgent to protect. But sitting there watching history unfold on television, Joe finally understood the full significance of what he had done. The listening post in Senator Caldwell's basement had been gathering intelligence on American defense programs and military capabilities. The conversations recorded there had been transmitted to Moscow, where Soviet military planners used them to assess American strength and make their own strategic decisions. For 18 months, from the spring of 1961 through that November morning when Joe knocked loose 3 bricks, the Soviets had possessed a window into the most sensitive discussions of American defense policy. The intelligence they gathered had likely influenced Soviet behavior during the Cuban Missile Crisis, giving them insights into American thinking and capabilities that affected their calculations about how far they could push before provoking American military response. By discovering the listening post and reporting it to the FBI, Joe had helped close that window at a crucial moment in Cold War history. The subsequent FBI operation using the listening post to feed disinformation to Soviet intelligence had likely contributed to Moscow's miscalculations and eventual decision to withdraw missiles from Cuba. Joe's simple act of noticing a hollow wall and deciding to investigate it had cascading effects that reached far beyond anything a plumber from Northeast Washington could have imagined. Joe died in 1993 at the age of 82, taking most of his secrets to the grave. Only after his death did Agent Brennan, long retired from the FBI, contact the Kowalski family to explain Joe's role in Operation Hollow Wall. By then, the Cold War had been over for several years, and the classified protections around the case had been partially lifted. Brennan sat in Catherine's living room, now surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and told them how their husband, father, and grandfather had contributed to American national security at a crucial moment in history. He had not sought recognition or reward, had simply done what his conscience demanded when confronted with evidence of espionage against his adopted country. Catherine listened to Brennan's account with tears streaming down her face, finally understanding the burden Joe had carried for more than 30 years. She thought about the nights he had lain awake beside her, the times he had seemed distracted or worried without explanation, the quiet pride he had taken in his work that seemed to extend beyond normal satisfaction in a job well done. Now she knew. Joe had been a patriot in the most fundamental sense of the word. Not someone who waved flags or made speeches about American greatness, but someone who acted with courage when circumstances demanded it, who put the common good ahead of personal comfort, who understood that citizenship required more than just paying taxes and obeying laws. The listening post itself was eventually removed from Senator Caldwell's basement and sent to FBI headquarters for analysis and preservation. The radio equipment, the microphone system, and several reels of recorded conversations became part of the Bureau's classified collection of Soviet espionage artifacts. In later years, when the FBI began selectively declassifying materials from the Cold War era, portions of Operation Hollow Wall were made available to researchers and historians. Academic papers were written analyzing the case as an example of how human factors, the unpredictable element of a conscientious plumber noticing something wrong, could compromise even the most sophisticated intelligence operations. The case was used in counterintelligence training programs to illustrate the importance of physical security and the vulnerabilities created by equipment that required regular servicing. Intelligence professionals studied how Volkov had been caught because he insisted on personally collecting the tape reels rather than using more secure, though less direct, communication methods. The case demonstrated that even highly trained intelligence officers could make operational mistakes when they prioritized intelligence value over security protocols. But beyond the professional analysis and historical documentation, Operation Hollow Wall represented something more fundamental about the Cold War and the society it created. The conflict between the United States and Soviet Union was not just fought by spies and soldiers, by intelligence officers running networks and military personnel standing ready at missile silos. It was also fought by ordinary citizens who chose to remain alert, who trusted their instincts when something seemed wrong, who had the courage to report their suspicions to authorities despite the personal risks and potential embarrassment. Joe Kowalski represented thousands of such citizens whose small acts of vigilance collectively created a defensive network that made successful espionage operations more difficult and more dangerous for America's adversaries. The plumber who noticed a hollow wall, the secretary who reported suspicious questions from a colleague, the librarian who recognized that someone was systematically photographing technical manuals, the cab driver who noted that a passenger was being picked up at the same corner at the same time every week. These ordinary observations by ordinary people, when reported to proper authorities and investigated by professionals, formed a crucial line of defense in a conflict where information was as valuable as weapons. The story of how Joe Kowalski found a hidden listening device in Senator Caldwell's Georgetown home never made headlines or appeared in history textbooks. It remained classified for decades, known only to the small number of FBI agents and intelligence officials directly involved in Operation Hollow Wall. But the impact of Joe's discovery rippled outward in ways that shaped Cold War history. The intelligence the Soviets lost when the listening post was compromised. The disinformation they received during the subsequent FBI operation. The network members identified and neutralized because of the investigation Joe's discovery initiated. All of these effects accumulated into something significant, though their full scope would never be completely measurable or publicly known. When the last members of the Kowalski family gathered for Catherine's funeral in 1998, Agent Brennan attended and brought with him a framed letter from the director of the FBI. The letter, written in formal language and bearing official seals, commended Joseph Edward Kowalski for his exemplary service to the United States in matters concerning national security. The letter did not specify what Joe had done or when he had done it, maintaining the classified protection that still surrounded certain details of Operation Hollow Wall. But it acknowledged his contribution and expressed the nation's gratitude for his courage and patriotism. The letter now hangs in the home of Joe's oldest son, displayed alongside his father's plumbing license and photographs from the 1940s, showing a young immigrant's son building a business in America's capital city. Visitors who see the letter ask about it, and the family explains in general terms that Joe helped the FBI during the Cold War, that he had discovered something important during his work and reported it to proper authorities. The specific details may remain protected for years to come as intelligence agencies continue to safeguard sources and methods even from conflicts long concluded. But the essential truth is clear. Joe Kowalski, master plumber, husband, father, and immigrant's son, had been called upon by history to make a choice, and he had chosen correctly. He had seen something wrong, reported it despite his doubts, cooperated with the investigation despite his fears, and by doing so had protected the country that had given his family refuge and opportunity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.